Max Dickins, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm really good. I'm very glad to be on the show and glad to share this stuff with your audience, who I think are interested in it, open-minded about how they might change some things in their life. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm excited too. And this is a topic that's pretty close to my heart as well. It's been something that's fascinated me over the past few years or so. To come across your book, to come across your work was a really, really interesting experience for myself. So I'm excited from a personal standpoint to ask you some questions today and have a conversation. But like we mentioned, I think it's going to have a massive amount of value for the listeners as well. But for those who may have not come across yourself before, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what it is that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Max. I've got a book out at the moment called Billy No Mates: How I Realise Men Have a Friendship Problem, and that's the thing I'm kind of most sort of fascinated about at the moment. This kind of whole thing stemmed from a personal realization of basically going, oh my God, I'm in my 30s, I'm a man, where have all my friends gone? And then thinking, oh, loads of other guys are in the same position, I realised, and I thought, well, why does this go wrong? What can we do about it? So I spent a couple of years of my life essentially treating myself as a human guinea pig to solve this problem. And also I was trying to find a best man, because that was kind of the inciting incident of this whole quest, was me going, oh wow, I've got no one in my life to fill that role. So I wrote a book about it.
Did you ever find a best man in the end?
Well, there is kind of a twist. There is a twist in the tale. But for listeners who might read the book, I won't reveal it. But I'll say it's a happy ending, but it's not the happy ending that you maybe would assume.
That's definitely an incentive to read the book if this sparks people's curiosities thereafter as well. But yeah, I actually found this particularly fascinating. I'm in a very similar position as well. I'm planning to propose to my girlfriend this year. Don't worry, she already knows that. But
Okay. Well, she knows that you're going to propose.
yeah, it's been on the agenda for a little while now. So she's aware that it's happening. She just doesn't know when and where. So we're keeping that top secret. But yeah, and I was thinking the same thing, and you mentioned it's a time in your life where you literally have to list all of your friends in an order of a priority as well. And it's like, well, where did they all go? I thought I had loads of friends. I thought I had this super solid friendship group. But what I want to go into first is, why is this such a problem? Because I am someone, again, who shared similarities to yourself. I have my girlfriend, I have my family, I love my work. So why is it such a problem that specifically men, I find at least, and we're going to dig into that in a little bit more detail, why is it a problem that we don't have friends, even if we've got fulfillment in our other areas of life?
Good question. There's a lot, I think, a lot in that question. So the first thing I would say, because I sometimes get messages from men saying like, I don't have many friends and I don't want them, so stop having a go at me, which I can understand. So basically, there's no right number of friends to have. And if you're happy with the number of friends you've got, that's absolutely fine. But what the research suggests is lots of men are not happy with it, and they do have a challenge. And the challenge they have is essentially in two directions. So the first direction is, there's loads of studies that say this. I mean, there's a famous one by Movemeber, the mental health foundation, that came out. It asked men, how many close friends have you got? And 1 in 3 men they asked could think of no one at all. And and then they asked the same group of people, how many people in your life could you talk to about something like big, hefty, like relationship problem, money problem, health problem, that sort of thing? And half of the guys couldn't think of anyone. So that kind of sums up one challenge men have. They might have lots of mates. So you mentioned work, you mentioned you might have a hobby, like, gym mates, whatever. We've got kind of a bevy of mates that we have this kind of informal relationship with, but we don't have those avenues for the more close, more personal disclosure, a sense that someone really knows you and you know them. And the second element then is that as we get older, whether you're male or female, your social world does get smaller. It peaks, by the way, in your late teens, early 20s, and then kind of
All downhill from there.
all downhill from there. So don't. You're like a lot of people if you're hearing this and go, "Oh my God, that's me." But if you look at men's social world, it shrinks a lot more than women's. And so those are the two things, which suggest there's something inherent in men that is going a bit wrong, both for the intimate sort of friendships and also in our social worlds more generally. But you said, family, girlfriend, work, lots of great sources of passion and joy, and that's great. But I would say it's important if that's true for you, because it was true for me as well, is that when life slows down and you need a friend, or you get into trouble and you need a friend, that's when you kind of realize the cupboard is bare, and it's better to do something about it before you get to that point. So, for example, if you look around evidence around divorce, bereavement, retirement, that's when men often have bad mental health outcomes, bad physical health outcomes, especially compared to women, because in those pinch points you need friends. Suddenly you're like, oh, I haven't got them. So it's not necessarily about feeling you've got no one and you're just this kind of, the idea we think of a lonely guy is it's the school lunch hall, they've got biscuits in their hair, they stink. You know what I mean? Or that guy. But actually, people like that look like me. They look like you, and so we can take the stigma away, but also appreciate that friendship is not the same thing as busyness.
Yeah, that's a very, very good distinction. And a point you made in another interview that you did is that it's not even just about those moments, it's also about when you have good news, who are you going to call, right? And I think that that was a big part as well. It's like, it's not only about who you're going to share the hard times with, but it's like which friends you actually want to call during the good times. And that's also another position where you realize that the cupboard is more bare than you actually initially thought, right?
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you brought that up actually, because I was thinking about that today, and I read something about, achievement is much more meaningful when it's kind of connected to a relationship, when it's witnessed in some way, and you feel like there's some common experience around it. Like if you do something really well in your life, but it's just you who knows, then it just feels less satisfying. And yeah, I think it's a similar sort of thing. Is that if you've not got anyone to talk to about the bad things, we often get quite awkward as blokes by talking about the good things as well. Like if you talk about, kind of touching it in the book, we're very happy as guys often to talk about our goals, right? So I want to make this a month. I want to bench press this. I want to run this time, 5K, whatever. But if you go about hopes, something a bit more kind of meaty and, I don't know, feels a bit vainer, right? Then that's when we don't really want to talk about it. So talking about the good stuff and talking about the bad stuff, I think it's quite intimately connected.
Absolutely. And you mentioned there that the social circles of just about all of us reduces over the course of time. Why is it the women are so much better than us at maintaining those social connections compared to us men?
I mean, there's a couple of things going on. There's sort of like three main theories with all of this stuff that kind of interact, and we'll probably touch on all three of them today. But to answer that question as it comes up, one of them, the kind of less controversial view, and there is absolutely lots of evidence for this, is that women do a lot more work, put a lot more effort into it. In two ways, in terms of the mental work of keeping it front of mind and having it on the dashboard, right? Don't they have friendship on the dashboard along with all the other things in their life? And on the friendship bit of the dashboard, they've got like 12 relationships, and they kind of, it's like my wife's like amazing. She's like, someone's had a baby, you've got to send them a baby comforter. And I'm like, what? Who's had a baby? All right, oh my God. She's like, I've already sent it. I was like, okay, great. Oh, we haven't replied to that invite. We've got a wedding in 3 years. What? Yeah, she's got it all going. So they're managing it mentally, but then they're doing something about it. So they are putting in the effort into organising, having coffees, into phoning people up, into just keeping relationships ticking over and being proactive with that. Women are socialised; they're brought up a lot more to do that, and they carry that through to adulthood. The classic thing I always kind of bring up, I think, with this is we think about what happens at Christmas time in your family, or whatever the big kind of celebration is in your family. Who is organising getting the family together? Who's buying turkey or whatever? Who's thinking about, who's sitting next to who? It's often the women doing that sort of social work, and that extends to the friendship world as well. So they're putting more effort in. So that's kind of one half of it. And actually, that's one reason why men struggle with friendship when they're not in relationships, is because they'll often in relationships outsource that work to the woman or to their girlfriend. So if you look at research around, married men are less lonely than unmarried men, and the difference is there is a woman there who's like the switchboard, right?
Yeah.
Okay. you've got that, and then the more kind of controversial angle on this, Elliot, is there is a fair amount of evidence now that in terms of basic social emotional skills, women may be on average, more equipped than guys. And a small example of this is even temperament. So I was talking to some dads the other day. I did an event, and it was for a thing called Dad La Soul. It's just for just events for dads, right? And often a lot of dads are quite lonely. So I did an event with them, and we were talking about the pickup from school. And they said when you see mums do the drop off at school, they're like, smiley, open, warm. They're sparking conversations. They go, "Oh, hello, I've not met you. Oh, I'm Judith." Whereas the blokes show up, they're closed. They're aggressive. They look like they face like a smacked ass, right? It's not necessarily that they're dicks. They're just like that's what men are like in public, and so they're not sparking conversations. They're like everyone's a bit aloof and unapproachable, and that's kind of it. That I suppose is an example of do we learn that shit, or is that stuff that is kind of in us? And I think it's probably a bit of both, and culture exaggerates it. So, I mean, in the book, I kind of unpack a lot of that sciencey evolution origin stuff. And that's the sort of conversation you see less often in media discussions on this thing, because it's a bit more controversial, because we're not allowed to really believe in sex differences anymore, it seems.
That's, yeah, unfortunately true. But at the same time, if we look at the examples, of course, it's not going to be every single man, but it's fair to say that even if you just close your eyes and think of that school pickup example, your mind immediately goes to the mums interacting and maybe like one dad stood there in the corner versus anything else. And like, that's just me with my perception of what that would be. That's literally the imagination the imaginative thought that comes to my mind in that moment. So I think a lot of people will be able to relate to that as well. And we mentioned that connections and going just beyond mates is probably going to be the most important thing. Like going from just having a bunch of mates, work mates, hobby mates, to having like genuine connections. How do we go about taking that transition? Because I had this conversation a little while ago with my therapist, maybe like 1 or 2 years ago, and I was trying to look at the return on investment in friends, and I was like, well, if I spend 4 or 5 hours with a friend, that's 4 or 5 hours I could be doing on this. And I travel a lot, and if in all honesty, that's even more effort to create a friendship circle when you're not staying in a country for a long time. So going on a Tinder date was way easier than actually making a friend. So how do we go from taking just our mates that we have all the way to genuine, reliable friends who we can essentially lean on in those tough times and those amazing times as well?
Great. It's a good question. I mean, I would say firstly, to kind of, I often talk about friendship like this. Friendship exists as a system in that we rely on different friends at different times for different things. So not every friend has to be the same sort of friend. So I'm not saying every friend in your life, if you're watching this and you're a guy, has to be that uber close, super emotion friendship. I think you need some of those. So how do we get some of those? And I'll use a kind of metaphor of investment there. I think there's kind of a power law in how you behave or in how you would invest in these friendships that get really good returns. And I would say the first one is be deliberately affectionate. And the second one I'll get to in a moment. But by deliberately affectionate, it's important for this reason, is that friendships are inherently ambiguous. They just are. And so if we're not calling it out, it's very hard to know, especially in male friendships, if they even like you. I've had friends, I realised when I wrote this book, I was like, I've known that guy for 20 years. I've got no idea if he likes me. I see him 10 times a year. Does he? I don't know. Like, we behave like we hate each other. But I've seen him 20 years, right?
Yeah.
I spoke to someone, I sat next to someone at a dinner thing, and he said, I've been best man 7 times. And he said to me, but 2 of those guys were not even in my top 20 friends, he reckoned. And I was like, oh, that is the thing, the fear of friendship, right? Are they as into me as I'm into them? That's the ambiguity, right? The hierarchy is super weird and hard to grasp. So the thing to do then is to try and take the ambiguity out and be quite direct with affection. So, here's just some simple ways of doing that. One is to tell your friends you like them. I know that sounds like 101, like, yeah, what's next? But how often have you done that? And don't assume they know, because often I didn't, like I said, I didn't know, even people I've known for ages. Um, be specific in your praise. Right, men don't give each other compliments. I could talk about the research here. There's some really funny studies about it. Men don't get compliments and they don't give them. And a lot of men are going like, well, someone give me a effing compliment. So you can give compliments. But I read another lovely thing the other day. Said we really like people who like us skillfully. So how do you like someone skillfully? It's not just going, hey, you're a good bloke. It's going, hey, I think the way you are with, I saw the way you were with your son the other day, and I just thought you dealt with him so well. It was just really inspiring to see that. Just a small moment, not a big cheesy, oh my God, someone set me on fire and end this moment. Just a little one. Um, I'd also say, doesn't have to always be a meetup. Like often I think guys are like beers or nothing, but checking in is saying it's front of you. You're in their kind of in their mind space a bit. Like I've got a friend, a guy called Oliver, who's a really great guy. He did something really simple. He sent me a postcard the other day, and it had like 4 lines on the back. So didn't take him very long. It had a second class stamp. Cheers, mate. But it was just like, all right, I'm in Margate. I saw this stupid postcard. Anyway, cheers. And I was like, oh, well, that's nice. And then I reply on WhatsApp and going, oh, thanks so much. Get his address, and I'm going to send him a book at the weekend, right? And it's just little things, not big things. Um, Another tip is fold them into your life a bit, just with things you're interested in. Like it's about how do you make this work when you're super busy. Like if you're really into, I don't know, stand-up comedy, you get 2 tickets to see Kevin. You get to see Kevin Bridges. Get 2 tickets and invite a mate. Like it's just small things. It's just putting yourself out there. Guys love other blokes who initiate stuff because no blokes ever do. So there's that. So we kind of covered the affection thing. Um, and then you've got the second kind of big tranche, I think, is around vulnerability, which is about sharing information about yourself, which is maybe quite secret, so not a lot of people know it. It's quite personal. It's often the grubbier side of you, the more sincere. So sincere, I learned the other day, Elliot, it's a Latin word, comes from sincere, which is without wax. So do you know what I mean? It's like, and in ancient Rome, they cover wax in basically terrible jewelry to hide the fact that it would be made badly, and so it covered all the blemishes. So like, show some of that stuff. So when things aren't going so well, someone says, "How are you?" You're gonna go, "Do you know what? Not good. I'm actually in. Me and my wife started seeing a marriage counsellor. It's quite stressful." Or whatever it is. And it doesn't have to be a lot, but little bits of that and going first with it make an absolutely enormous difference because it creates permissions between you. So a lot of male friendship, I reflected in my own groups, like what are the permissions in this dynamic? What are we allowed to do? What are we allowed to say? And are those permissions likely to end up in us having proper conversations about stuff and really knowing each other? So how can you change those permissions? A lot of it is just role modeling it. And you'd be amazed at how much of a difference that makes really quick.
Yeah, I can imagine. I remember on the affection part, I had a friend who our position of friendship is in that ambiguous area right now. But before, when we used to meet, he would message afterwards and be like, I really enjoyed the meetup today. Just 2 lines about how I enjoy seeing you. Can't wait to do it again. And that was something that I thought was like top quality. Like it was something I took away and I was like, that's fantastic. It's like, even though you spent the day together and felt that you had a great interaction, it's nice to have someone just confirm that they also enjoyed themselves and they're looking forward to seeing you again, right? And I was like, that was
Man,
based off of him.
that's massive. And also what I love about that example you gave is that it's not a lot of effort. And it's more just putting the thought into it, and it makes a bit. It's just little things. I mean, as long as it's not, you don't send the same one every time, and there's a bit of thought to
Copy and paste.
it. Yeah, and they put it doesn't even change the name. Hi, Darren.
Sick.
But I read this thing the other day about from a psychologist, and this is apparently there's tons of research into this called the liking gap, which basically we really underestimate how much other people like us, and especially how it kind of applies with strangers as well. Like we assume a stranger who we've met a couple of times thinks we're a bit of a dick or we're a bit weird or we're boring, and actually the research suggests it's never like that. They think the same about you. I think often in friendships, if you don't do those little gestures, you're like, did Matt even enjoy that?
Yeah, and a lot of it as well, I think, is a big self-confidence thing, right? Because when you say the idea of taking the lead in these certain situations, all it sounds like to many men, which I can imagine when you think about the fears of it, is rejection, it's discomfort, it's time wasted. So do we have to really be brave and maybe come from a good place of self-worth and self-confidence to be available to accept that? Because if it's almost like the idea of approaching a girl in a cafe as well. Like if you're single and just trying to get her number or something like that, it's like it's the same things. You're opening yourself up for rejection, discomfort, potentially time wasted. But on the other side of that is, the potential partner of your life, right? So is it the same kind of concept in that we just got to take a little bit more of the initiative and just be open to saying, well, they might not actually enjoy it that much, but at the same time, at least we asked and we now know.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. So I wrote the thing the other day about when you we show initiative with friendships and you kind of put the work in. You're the one organising. You're the one going first. A lot of the things we've talked about, and it doesn't work out. It can feel a little bit like you say, what a waste of time, or they're not keeping their side of the bargain. But I think it's just kind of a rule of thumb, like as a way of being in the world, you're on average more likely to get a better result than if you don't do that. You've almost got to see it as the cost of doing business. The cost of doing social business is that sometimes you'll be let down, sometimes they won't respond right. But if you see it over an arc of interactions, you're going to get a good reaction. But I did also like something you said there about it can be uncomfortable to kind of receive it or to do it. But especially, I think, especially to receive it, a lot of guys are not used to being told nice stuff. It's something I have to, I really fight against. I'm lucky enough to get sent emails from readers, which is great. I mean, I love getting them. I find it really hard to read a really nice email. I go like, oh, I don't know what to do, and then respond to it. And I always do respond, but it's so weird that I will find it very easy to read a horrible, like, you're terrible email. But I'm like, oh, someone being nice to me? This is alien. Because it's like it is, like you say, it is a bit vulnerable. You sort of open yourself up and going, oh, they've seen me. They've seen what I've tried to do. And I think a lot of the time, it's kind of part of the same package is being able to talk about the bad stuff. It's also about being able to receive the good stuff. Like, it's something I've reflected on is, and I think maybe people watching this, listening to this is when someone gives you a compliment, how do you deal with that? Do you let it land on you and show that it's landed on you and say thank you and enjoy it and give them the gift of letting them have that moment? Or do you brush it off or make a joke? Which I think guys, we often do, right?
Yeah, exactly. I was just thinking any response to a compliment is usually like, yeah, I could have done better. I'm planning this for next time. Or, and then that's what it ends up with. It's just like a little bit of a mumble of how well can I deflect this so I don't actually have to accept it and acknowledge it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. A guy comes up to you and says, hey, I like you've had a haircut. It looks cool. You go, yeah, I've got to have a haircut because I'm such a fucking fat prick.
Exactly
You
right.
know? Rather than being like, okay, I wasn't saying that.
And that's a very male thing as well. I'm not sure. I think actually women do the deflecting thing as well. I think that's
Oh,
quite
women do the
fair.
deflecting thing.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
certainly do as well. So maybe it's just a human thing, full stop as
Yeah.
well.
I love how women give each other compliments on Instagram. That's a very female thing. You don't see men doing that.
Yeah,
Like,
that's a very good point.
there's a photo of someone he just doing anything, and it's like a load of fire emojis underneath.
And it's a good point. And maybe they will compliment something like a new car, but not how they're looking in that suit that they posted themselves in. Whereas a woman would not post on the new car that the woman got, but she'll post on when she's wearing a really nice dress. So it's a curious way of complimenting each other, which brings us on to the state of masculinity. I'm really curious to get your take on this. It seems to be in a very fragile place at this moment. It's like the traditional values of being male might not have served us super well, or now these days they're being branded as, misogynistic or super old fashioned, stone age. But then if you try and tap into your feminine side and be a little bit more vulnerable, then you're called a fairy, you're called all these different types of things. So what is your current take on masculinity as it stands today? And where do you find that center point for us who want to embrace being a man and not be ashamed of it or even accept that there's any gender differences whatsoever? Massive question.
Yeah, big question, but a really interesting one, and obviously it's in the news a lot at the moment. And um, maybe start right at the beginning. Like, what is masculinity? Masculinity is the cultural idea of what it means to be a man. And so the question then is, what the performance of being male. So how do you show you're a man? And it used to be that that performance was around, being strong, being fighter, being brave, being provider, exactly all those things that we're kind of familiar with. The argument is that in that definition was left out a lot of things to do with our relationships and to do with our emotions. Um, and undoubtedly, masculinity is softening, it's becoming much more open. And it depends on the context you're in. Class is relevant, where you are in the country is relevant, your age, your job. There's different kind of definitions in different places, so it's more inclusive in certain places than others. So I think, in a sense, masculinity is becoming a lot more inclusive, a lot healthier. What I think is dangerous is that actually it goes in the completely opposite idea. So people used to criticize an old definition of masculinity by saying they called it essentialist, right? The academics would say, oh, if you say men have to have a big car, be rich, big muscles, be 6'6", these are just kind of, you pick them out of your arse. They're just ideas from nowhere. And so where did we get this definition from? Is the argument, like we're making it, and the idea is that it's the cultural definition of masculinity is made to preserve male power and a certain sort of man's power. But then on the opposite direction, without getting too wanky about this, Elliot, is when people say, "Oh, men should be talk about their emotions all the time. Masculinity is about kindness." You go like, "Okay, but where have you got that from? You just picked different qualities, and they don't have any basis." You might argue that being kind and talking about your emotions is a better form of masculinity, but you can't criticize the first one for being picked out of thin air and then say that one is not. I think I think generally we need to have much more of an understanding of context and what behaviors are healthy for men and women is really dependent on the context. So, for example, if you're in a situation with a friend who's having a really tough time, what's an appropriate form of masculinity in that moment? It is to be more emotionally connected, to listen better, to be more patient, to cancel the workout you're going to do, to make a bit more space for them, to take some time off work and address that. That's a healthy form of masculinity. But if you're in a context where you're a soldier, you want people who are going to be aggressive and not going to muddle through. So it really, what is appropriate masculinity really depends on the context. And often I see in popular culture certain forms of masculinity being criticised without any consideration of the culture. So if you have a go at sort of certain working class men from manufacturing backgrounds have been brought up in really tough upbringings, being a bit aggressive and not knowing all the right words to say. It's like, yeah, but you've got to understand the context where, yeah, and that made sense there. That was actually, it wasn't unhealthy there. And then maybe you get into a new context, it has to change. So, you probably tell from my answer, I think it's really complicated and I don't have a brilliant answer. I think there needs to be empathy, and we've maybe lost that, and we've got two poles we've got kind of the reactionary alt-right men, and Andrew Tate, men should be like this, and we've got kind of a load of gender theorists saying, actually, no, let's turn that all on its head. And actually, most of us are in the muddy middle going, I don't want to be old school man, and I don't relate to it, and it's certainly not healthy. But I don't want to be man 3.0, which I kind of don't really relate to either. And I kind of feel guilty for saying that. So it's kind of a mix. And then also you've got, I know this is a ridiculously long answer, but also it's interesting, I think, when you look at dating, it comes out a lot in dating, gender stuff, because we have a cultural conversation about how we want men to be and what is a healthy definition of masculinity. But then if you look at the data that comes out of dating apps and the sort of men that do really well on there, you're like, that data could have come out of the Flintstones if they had apps. Right? Do you know what I mean? It's like, oh, guess what? Guys who are 6'5", got great cheekbones and are really rich do amazingly well, and everyone else does quite badly. Like, it's kind of, there are kind of signals we get that contradict a lot of the cultural stuff. So it's interesting. I don't know if that answers your question. I think it's a good one, and I'm trying to probably think out loud and figure it out.
No, I think that that's the way to navigate this whole conversation. There's no black and white answer. And when you look into the old school style of things, part of it makes sense. And you look in the new style of things, that also makes sense. So it's like, okay, well, where do we stand? How do we kind of keep some of these traditional male values? Because when you talk about, being strong, being rich, etc., in a modern context, they make sense from an evolutionary standpoint, right? The stronger one, thousands of years ago, has the ability to protect his tribe. The richer one in the modern context is the one who was able to provide for his tribe and, look after his family. So they make a lot of sense. They've just kind of updated themselves from being the one who gets the food to the one who drives the nice car and now wears the Rolex, right? So it's just modern context, but traditional values. So it's curious. And then you look at maybe some of the new school approaches and you're like, okay, well, compassion might have looked like a agreement between different tribes and being able to say, this is my territory, this is your territory, let's keep this peaceful, let's not go to war, etc. But now maybe in a modern context, that compassion can turn into something a little bit more, let's say, weaker, just so to speak, just to use the, lack of a better term there. So it's just about finding the way to utilize new school and old school in the modern context. And I think it's just about finding that center point, but who knows where that center point is. And I think, as you alluded to, it's all context dependent, which makes me want to ask, where is your position right now? Where is your middle point towards traditional quote unquote masculine values and the new school masculine values? Where do you stand, and what particular traits do you like to live by?
I wouldn't say necessarily live by a set of traits. I suppose I live by a set of instincts, like everyone does, and then also on top of those instincts have a layer of analysis which makes me think, is that healthy, unhealthy, optimal, suboptimal? So a good example is, my instinct is to make a joke out of absolutely everything, right? That's you would say, quite a masculine way of relating, but that's suboptimal. It's not healthy. So I've now going, well, that's an instinct. That's maybe a kind of an old school gender norm. And I've gone, well, I'm trying and go away from that, but I don't want to completely leave it behind. There's some times where I think it's a really fun way of being in certain contexts, but you have to have different gears on the gear stick. So I think rather than saying there's a set number of traits, for me, it's just about going through certain gears in a way that gives you access to both old and new. I think this conversation is really confused by the fact that it's conflated with arguments around equity. So by which I mean the fact that women have had a terrible end of the deal politically, economically, sexually for centuries. A lot of the old school ways of thinking about gender and thinking about what a man is, what a woman is, were designed to keep those inequities in place and to defend them. So I can completely understand why people get a bit uncomfortable when anyone talks about, well, men are like this and women are like this, because they go, well, who gets to say? And generally, it's the powerful people who get to make those decisions. Connected here is a lot of the conversation around uh, trans, which I do not want to talk about today. No one needs to know anything from me about that subject. But it's kind of conflated, right? Because it's actually essentially asking, how do you construct gender? Where does it come from? So those two things have become mixed in with ideas of innate kind of ways of behaving to become completely confused, the whole thing. So that when we talk about actually men are more like to be like that, some people will hear, oh, but oh, what you're saying that inequality is right then. It's like, well, no, it's just more likely to have that behavior. Anyway,
It's a pretty extensive topic and probably one that we're not going to get to the bottom of today.
no, we're not going to get to the bottom of it, but I think it's, the reason why it's important to kind of think about it a bit is if you don't understand some average sex differences, then you talk about male loneliness and male mental health. If you don't understand that there are some differences, you then don't design interventions that work. That's why it's important, not some grand philosophizing about this subject. And there's people much smarter than me make much more coherent arguments than the ones I've probably made today. But what's important is, for example, you want to have men who have friends, and you're, for example, a government trying to fund a scheme. Do you know what works for men? Is men's sheds. It's a load of blokes who go to a shed to make shit. Now, that sounds pretty sexist. What? Men like sheds? Men like using tools and building shit in sheds? Yes. It's like the most successful intervention, but it's also on the one hand like unbelievably gendered. But then on the positive side of men's sheds, and I've visited them and they're great, all of them basically let women in now. Women seem less likely to want to go. Generally, there's 8 to 10 people, 8 of them would be male, 2 of them be female, for example. But they're welcome, and the atmosphere is inclusive and nice. But it's quite a old school male-ish thing, and it works. So that's why this subject, I think, is important.
Yeah, well, it's also very important due to the statistics on male suicide at this moment in time as well. And it's not ever to say that one gender suicide is a bigger problem than the other. It's just that this is going up at an alarming rate at this moment in time. How much do you think that this loneliness, this specifically male loneliness problem, contributes to the current rates that we're seeing?
Well, it's definitely very closely connected. So there's all sorts of different research here. So suicide is a very complex thing. There's never one cause, and so I can't say it's definitive. But if you ask the Samaritans, they do. The Samaritan Suicide Report talks about men having less access to all forms of social connection, and that being one of the major risk factors in male suicide. There's been lots of research that looking at causes of depression. Again, depression is complex, but one of the biggest preventers of depression is having strong social connections. If you look at the Harvard study of adult life, the longest longitudinal study ever conducted since the mid-1930s, still going now, they looked at what makes people live longer and be happier. The number one thing was relationships, and the number 2 thing was the strength and quality of those relationships. So it helps you live longer, it helps you be happier, it helps you be less depressed, and it's intimately connected to the mental health thing. But I think a lot of these things are connected because for me, I got interested in what masculinity meant, a subject I didn't really feel was for me, through the friendship door. And I went, why don't I have any friends? Why don't I have any close friends? Oh, it's how I'm behaving. And I go, oh, I'm behaving like that because it's kind of how I thought men were meant to behave. And I've subconsciously absorbed about behaving like that and some innate factors, but also those culturally constructed things. So I think thinking about your relationships is a great way of thinking about the sorts of things that are sort of behaviors that are good for your mental health. Because if you can have the emotional intelligence to understand how you feel and express how you feel and have that language, you're also going to be able to understand how to talk about your own mental health and to deal with struggles you're going through. So all of this stuff is so connected.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of it's about breaking generational cycles as well, right? And I think that hopefully the children, are children on the agenda for yourself in the near future?
Well, we're currently at the negotiation stage, me and my wife.
Okay, so
So
you're in the
yeah.
negotiation stage. So when the deal is closed and the new signing arrives, then I hope that, let's say that a male does arrive into your life or a little boy arrives into your life. I assume you're going to be parenting him in a different way compared to the way that you were parented as well. And I think a lot of it is now downstream. That's why I love having conversations with people like you, Max, because it's about raising that awareness. And then obviously, if you notice that behavior in yourself, and like you mentioned, then you take on some emotional intelligence skills and you start to behave in a different way, and you start to be the leader in your friendship circle to behave in a certain way, to give people the opportunity to open up, to have empathy, to have compassion, then hopefully that's the way the world ultimately improves. So when it comes to people raising the awareness and starting to become a little bit more in touch with what they feel masculinity is to them, in the sense that allows them to operate in this world and keeps them healthy and keeps them mentally healthy as well. What's going to be your approach to the future child that you have, if you do end up having a little boy or a little girl, in fact?
Yeah, I think it's as much as possible to get out of the way and not impose points of view necessarily onto them. And I think to an extent we do that inevitably, right? So my dad was a massive sports nut. He's 6'6", was like a fantastic rugby player. And so I grew up going like, that's what I want to be. He didn't even have to do anything. He was just there.
Yes.
So like inevitably you kind of absorb ideas of gender from people just from being around them. But I think the big thing I would do if I had a son would be to make sure from the word go that they valued the relational part of their life and of their identity as much as the achievement, the material part of their identity, and reinforce that in them, and do what the research suggests a lot of parents don't do, which is to notice emotional expression in boys, ask them to reflect and dwell on it, and try and coach them through talking about it. There's tons of studies about, for example, how parents react to, say, a 5-year-old. You got a boy and a girl. They both fall over in a shop, hurt their knee. If you've got a girl, people run over to the girl and go, "Are you all right? Are you crying? I'm sorry. It's going to be all right. It's going to be fine." The boy, they'll go, "You're going to be a brave boy. You're not going to cry. You'll be a brave boy. Be a good boy." Tiny little thing. We wouldn't even necessarily do a double take if it happened. But those things sort of all add up. There's another interesting studies around how we talk to boys and girls just about their day. Like, you asking them to talk about what they did or how they felt about what they did. It's a small thing. So I think I'd just try and put more focus on that, but as much as possible also let their own personality emerge. Because that's the other kind of factor here is we've talked about culture, like making us who we are. We talked about innate factors like our biology, going way back to our evolutionary past, but also things like personality type is relevant. So if you're watching this and you're an introvert, you're going to go, well, I'm not so into socializing some of my extrovert friends. That's fine as well. And to tell a load of introverts to go out and make 1,000 friends, they're going to be like, that sounds my idea of hell. That's absolutely fine as well. So you've got to kind of let the individual away from gender, which we've become absolutely obsessed about, and is clearly a huge thing, but away from that, letting that happen as well. I mean, it's a good question. I've not really reflected on it. Maybe there's a book in it.
There you go. There's your new Sunday Times bestseller.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I'll get you to do the foreword, Elliot. You see,
Looking
that's
forward
fine.
to it, mate. But on that note as well, you've mentioned that it's obviously down to an individual basis in terms of how we socialize and the friendships that we create. Is there also a geographical element to this as well? I had one of the most unusual for my eyes, especially growing up in the UK, experience when I went to Istanbul. And I don't know if you've been to Istanbul and you've looked in some of the coffee shops, but the people who are socializing there are men. There's men sat across the table from each other, sitting on their small stools with their little coffees and just chatting. And that is the majority of the city. It blew my mind because if you go to that example in UK, it's Costa Coffee and it's all the mums and the 50, 60-year-old ladies having a chat in the Costa Coffees, and you don't see any men really having a conversation. You might see one on his laptop having, a work session. But in Istanbul, it's literally the opposite, which blew my mind. And I was like thinking how amazing that is for men and the friendships they must have. Maybe there's another story about, how women are allowed to go out in Muslim countries, etc. But we're not going to get into that right now. But that aspect of it, in my optimistic mind, was very encouraging. So how much of it is geographical, especially when it comes to those who live in the UK as well?
So I think there's definitely anything to do with culture. So much of gender, so much of being men or women is a cultural idea, right? So when you change cultures, some of those ideas are going to be different. And Istanbul's a really interesting idea. I hadn't actually heard that before. So one thing that makes me think of is obviously there's a lot of Muslims, so you're not on the beers, right? So I was just thinking, like, if I asked a load of my friends to go and meet in a coffee shop, they'd probably be a bit like, really? But I think it's healthy that we can do that. I think it'd be a much better thing if we could actually meet up and have coffees than always have to be in the pub. Anyway, that's another story. But then Istanbul's a great example. I heard, I'm trying to think of the country, it's somewhere in the Middle East, where people told me they would go and they see male friends holding hands. And this is not a double take. It was just like, oh, it's just normal. In Argentina, men kiss each other on the cheeks. Same in France. So there's completely different ways of doing it, which shows, like you say, you were optimistic, and I think there is a reason to think that there are way more options of being male that we don't explore because we think they are only a certain way, and there's possibilities of doing it. I mean, a great example is this. I looked at the history of friendship and the history of. If you ask people now who are the best at being friends, whose friendship, who are the kind of kings or queens of it, they go, well, women are. But that idea would have been absolutely absurd before about basically the turn of the 20th century. It's basically entirely gendered as male friendship. The best, kind of the closest friendships of posterity were male-male friendships. And they were not only the ancient Greek sense where they just sat around talking about, grand ideas. In the Renaissance, it was very emotionally expressive. People would share beds, they talk, they write each other almost love letters. So the kind of modern way we might think of men in friendship is exactly that. It's modern. So across culture, across time span, across life span, if you see a group of older men together, they're very different to a group of younger men. So a lot of the ideas we have about how friendship works is just assumption, and mixing with that, there are some things that are less likely to change as well. But yeah, there's a lot of options on the table for us.
Yeah, and I think that once you do expose yourself to those different cultures and you start to see a different way, it's like, well, maybe I can bring a little bit back to my social group. And yeah, I'm not necessarily saying you need to hold hands with your mates now, but at the same time, there could be some ideas there that, like you said, the coffee shop example was great for me. I really liked seeing that, especially the sheer amount of men in the coffee shops was very impressive to me. So as you mentioned, there's more than one way to do things, and there's more than one setting that you can see your friends in other than the pub as well. So I think that's a good thing to remind people of. And with that being said, just to wrap up on some practical notes, we've spoken about like taking the initiative to acknowledge your friends, giving them affection. Are any kind of closing practical ways that we can take steps towards creating more meaningful connections with the current friends we have in our life, or even to make some new ones?
One thing I talk about is I call it the tent peg strategy. Think about why friendships go wrong when you get a bit older. It's because you have the intention of seeing friends and showing the initiative and being, great at all that stuff. And then life gets ridiculous. And then 2 months go past and you're like, oh God, I haven't seen Kevin for ages. And then you might meet up and you'll say to each other, oh, we must do this again really soon. And you'll mean it as well. You'll mean it.
5 years
and then life
later.
gets back. Yeah, exactly. 5 years cut to. Yeah, you're at a funeral. So how do you get around that? It's about having these tent pegs in the calendar that mean you don't have when you do lose that kind of that front of mind thing, you're still in touch. So for example, I do this fortnightly, roughly five-a-side football thing. There'll be some guys in that I don't have any contact with until we play again. They might not come to every game, might be 6 weeks. But when I fall off the friendship wagon, as it were, I know that's there. So what's the tent pegs for you? Like it might be, I met a guy who loves military board games, and he says I go every month. We go to military board game club, but like, it's not my sort of thing. But they absolutely love it. But they know that's in there, and they really look forward to it. So what are those tent pegs for you? Takes trying to get those in is important. Another thing I'd talk about is help yourself be lucky. So we like to think that we go out, well, we're going to go and make friends. I'm going to go and make friends. But often what happens is we make friends generally by being around people who like what we like and who are fairly similar, right? We like to think that there's some great audit of their soul, and then we match up and we're like, we're going to be friends. But generally, it's like you're just around each other loads, and you're like, all right. And then eventually, you didn't know how it happens. You're like, oh, we're friends, I suppose now. So how can you put yourself in situations where that's more likely to happen? And it's just about, I think, actually asking yourself, not how am I going to make friends? It's going, what am I into? What do I want to learn? What do I love doing? What do I want to spend my time on? Like whatever it is. Like it might be like, do you know what? I live by the river, so it might be like, you know what? I'm going to learn a kayak. And then you go to a kayaking course and you meet a couple of people locally on that. One of them you end up seeing pretty regularly and it becomes a friend. It might be you do you join a gym, right? Or whatever it is. Be in spaces when you're going to collide with others and let friendship happen. But I would always say, like, the thing is to get a life, not just get some friends. Because generally friends come with you on the journey. The journey is the crucial bit. Like what's the thing you're gonna the context you're going to share with them. So find those spaces. And the nice thing about that is it's kind of less intense. A lot of people go like, oh God, super awkward. And a big thing, maybe thirdly here, is avoid the WhatsApp trap, which is, it's like spinning plates, right? We have friends and it's like, oh, I'm just going to go to WhatsApp and just keep that plate spinning. But you don't want a load of spinning plates. You want some friends. And friendship happens face to face, sharing time, sharing space. Online is great as a keep things going, but we can labor under the illusion that we're keeping our friendships going just by that WhatsApp trap or the Facebook trap, or you comment on their tweets. We've all done it, right? And it kind of sates you. The example I gave the other day when I wrote a piece is it's just like having a load of sweets, right? And you kind of go, oh, my energy's up, I don't need to eat a meal, and then you have this crash that's even worse than if you hadn't had the sweets. That's what it can be like. You need to kind of have consistent nutrition. That's a nice, often in social worlds we use this metaphor of calories, like where are you getting your good calories from? Like, well, what's your balanced social diet? So being socially fit, and that comes from, proper time shared. Yeah, so those are some tips, and also loads more obviously in the book.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's some solid advice, Max. And it's been an amazing conversation. And before we leave, I do want to ask, where can people find you? Where can people find the book if they have been interested by this conversation, which I have no doubt that they would have been today?
Yeah, sure. So the book is called Billy No Mates, How I Realised Men Have a Friendship Problem. It's obviously in all shops, apart from tiny ones, probably. And obviously it's on, you get it on Amazon. And my website is maxdickins.com. There's loads of stuff about the book on there, loads of other interesting bits and articles and things and how-tos. I'm on Twitter at Max Dickins as well. Come and say hello and let me know your thoughts on this. Like, I really like hearing your little stories about, you know, the guy that messaged you after you met up and the Istanbul thing. So I like picking up these little tidbits as I go through. So if you've got any thoughts on this, do get in touch.
Perfect. I'll put all that in the show notes below. But Max, thank you for your time. It's been an amazing conversation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.